As a developer, you don't want to go where you're not wanted because you can spend so much emotional energy and time and money on fighting a city.
Are you about to start a podcast or producing a podcast and tired of doing the editing yourself? We have produced over 1,000 daily shows, and the production team that I've created, they're now available to produce shows for you as well. We can do as little or as much as you need, from finding and communicating with guests, preparing introductions, to editing the audio and video. You will sound better, have a more professional presence, and be able to spend your time doing other valuable tasks on your business. Let me know you're interested by emailing me directly at whitney@lifebridgecapital.com.
This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Sam Rust. Joining us today is Bob Voelker, who's a CPA, tax attorney, real estate attorney, and a multifamily developer with over 40 years of experience. Bob's got a background in complex, urban, mixed-use, high-rise residential, affordable housing development, as well as real estate finance, including institutional debt equity and creative financing alternatives. Bob was the lead attorney on the West Hollywood Hotel and Condos and Legacy Apartments in LA, and recently published a book on managing the complexities of real estate development. Bob, thanks for lending your expertise to the show today. Welcome.
No, thanks, Sam, for having me. I appreciate it.
As I was doing some research for this interview, I happened across some columns that you wrote for a magazine called Dallas, talking about the title of one that you wrote back a couple of years ago, Dallas's Growth Demands a Dialogue on Density. You're quite passionate about going for higher density versus lower density. Before we get into your background, I wanted to kind of pick at that a little bit and just see, you've done a lot of different things. You've seen real estate from a lot of different vantage points. You know, density makes sense from an economic standpoint, but can that be built? Should it be built in today's environment?
Yeah, density is, I think some people in the suburbs think of it as a four-letter word, and it shouldn't be. It's a way to house people closer to the kind of services that you want, a way to lower traffic counts, for one, because you can live, work, play closer to where you are. If you I guess the prototypical example would be looking at like Washington, D.C., where everything's like 5 or 6 stories tall. And you've got, retail or offices on the bottom, and then above that, you've got residential. And it makes for a very walkable environment. So if you want to have a healthier environment for people to live in, you want to lower your traffic count, a safer environment for people to be around, a safer place for your kids, density really makes sense. The alternative is sprawl. One of my favorite sayings when I kind of got into this concept of density in Dallas was that Dallas had one of two choices. We could either densify back into the urban core, or we could annex Oklahoma. And no one in Texas really wanted Oklahoma. So it seemed like, although it continues to build out that direction. And what's happened over time is you can just build wider, try and build wider and wider roads that ultimately are like funnels. And when you get to the bottom, if you pour too much in the top out in the suburbs, the bottom of the funnel can't handle it. And it just creates real problems. It also, people have done a lot of studies on this, but the cost for the suburbs of maintaining sprawled out infrastructure is really humongous. And what happens is it becomes a little bit of a pyramid scheme. The suburb needs to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger to support the infrastructure they built. And as they continue to expand the concentric circles out, the size of the infrastructure just gets bigger and bigger. And so if you really want a much more healthy economic city environment, you create these pockets of density. Again, perfect examples like Washington, D.C. If you've ever flown in over the river into Washington National, it's kind of a cool thing to do. You see all the monuments, is you'll see these little nodes of high density as you travel. And what those are is they're along the subway line. Wherever there's a subway station, you start seeing these nodes of density. And places like Dallas and Houston and other places that have put in Phoenix, that have put in rail lines, what they really need to do is then densify along those rail lines at the rail stations. Provides easy transportation for the people who are in that area. It's more affordable because you don't necessarily have to rely on a car. It just has lots of benefits for the city. Anyhow, long discussion, but that's why I'm a big fan of density.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense, especially along those rail corridors. I know here in Denver, they've expanded the light rail, and a lot of the city planners, both of Denver and some of the surrounding communities that were just connected, are trying to implement some of those density nodes that you're talking about, but then they're running into the NIMBY crowd.
Exactly.
And I'm curious, in your background, how have you dealt with those types of people that are not in my backyard. Density is fine over there, but not right here, successfully to get your projects up and off the ground?
Well, I'll answer that question in two ways. I was an affordable housing developer for 11 years when the first time I left the law firm. And for quite a while, I was developing in primarily lower income neighborhoods, in part because it was easier. You don't face the NIMBY crowds as much in lower income neighborhoods because, number one, they want to see development, and particularly development of new housing. Secondly, they want economic development in those areas of town. And probably most importantly, they don't have organized homeowner groups. What I learned over time was that 3/4 of the low-income housing tax credit projects that were being developed in Dallas, Houston, and Austin, San Antonio, were all being developed in low-income neighborhoods. So we were creating the next slum, so to speak, by putting all the low-income people in the same place. And so I started to say, okay, I want to get away from that model, and I wanted to start developing out in the suburbs. You take affordable housing out in the suburbs, and it's a good way to get yourself tarred and feathered or thrown out of your church, as the case may be. So I tried to do it in the suburb I lived in, and that didn't go very well. And so I actually got to the point where I was starting to file lawsuits against cities that wouldn't allow me to build. So I was trying to build on multifamily zoned land. So I wasn't trying to rezone because I knew that was a fool's errand.
Yeah.
So instead, I was trying to build on multifamily zoned land. And I had cities that literally would yank the zoning away from me. They just changed the zoning in midstream, even after I had, quote unquote, vested my zoning rights. And so I ended up suing cities for fair housing violations and for takings under the U.S. and state constitution. And I did that in Louisiana and Oklahoma and Texas. And that's when I decided to get out of affordable housing, because that's not very much fun. It takes a long time to go through that process. So that's one way. The other way that I learned over time is, as a developer, you don't want to go where you're not wanted, because you can spend so much emotional energy and time and money on fighting a city. And so early on, what I suggested to the young developers that I worked with when I was just a normal multifamily developer was, go figure out, even before you put a site under contract, go have a meeting with the city council person, with the mayor, with the planning department, find out who the neighborhood groups are, go meet with them, figure out if you're really going to be wanted there. And if not, go find another place to develop. It's just, life's too short.
Yeah. We say often on the syndication side of the business that life's too short to work with people you don't enjoy. It's harder to find developments where everybody's going to be in favor of it. But I do think that there's a lot of wisdom. And when you meet a significant amount of resistance, there's lots of other plots of ground that can be developed, often with less headache, less hassle, less money spent on attorney's fees.
Yeah, that you can also look at redevelopment opportunities. It's like, okay, where's a strip shopping center that's not working? Where's a shopping mall that's not working? Where's an old warehouse that needs to be torn down and be better put to, even a multifamily use may be a little more favorable than that. Although I've had people tell me they'd rather have warehouses than apartments, but anyhow.
Oh my goodness, people are interesting.
Yes.
So I was looking at your background, Bob. You started out as a tax accountant out of school, and then pretty quickly went to become a tax and real estate attorney. What drew you into real estate? What's the story behind that?
Well, when I started out as a tax accountant, I did that for a year, and then I went back to law school. And when I came out of law school as a tax attorney was in 1984. That's back when apartment syndications were just going like hotcakes. And most of my tax work was putting together syndications of apartment deals. So I did that from 84 to 86, 87. If you don't remember, we changed the tax laws drastically in 1984. You were probably not born then.
That was pre my time, yes.
Yes, drastically in 1984, and pretty much put tax lawyers out of business for a while. So I'd already done a lot of real estate related work. So I kind of shifted over into real estate, just straight up development work, and really enjoyed being a tax attorney. Is not the most exciting profession in the world. It's very technical, a lot of, looking at the tax code and studying tax code cases and all that kind of stuff. And as I started working with developers, they are fascinating people to be around. Sometimes a little bit crazy, but fun people to be around. They're very entrepreneurial. They move at a fast pace. They love it when you, as an attorney, can figure out their business and be involved in their business and help them promote their business. And so I really enjoyed that part of it. Unfortunately, I spent from about 87 to 92 taking apart a lot of the syndicated deals I put together as we went through a recession. So I learned kind of what happens when deals go bad. which is actually a very positive thing to learn. Once the economy turned, I really understood a lot about how to structure deals, having gone through that pain and suffering.
Yeah, there's so much we could dive in there, but carry us full circle. So you worked in the tax side, then you went to work more on the development side from like mid-90s, mid-2000s, and then back again as general counsel for a development group from 2015 to 2020. What inspired you to write the book after that varied career?
Well, one of the things I learned as an attorney is that most partners in law firms are very poor mentors. They're so busy working on the complex deals and dumping off pieces of that puzzle to their associates and or dumping off the lesser projects to their associates. And so it's hard to get a real estate partner who really wants to sit down and spend the time training a young lawyer. Then when I switched over on the development side, I learned that developers are very ADD. They're always chasing the next deal. They really don't, once they got a deal in the pocket, they're like, dump it off on an analyst or a young development guy and say, go do this deal. And they provide them almost no support whatsoever. Then the other thing I started to understand when I switched from being an attorney to developer the first time is there were lots of things I learned as a developer that I wish I had known as an attorney would have made me better at drafting documents and protecting my client. And there are a ton of things that being around developers that developers really need to know that lawyers know, but that never gets communicated. So there's just kind of this lack of interdisciplinary training that goes on, as well as within your own discipline training. And so what I wanted to do was kind of take what I learned on both sides of the equation as a lawyer and as a developer and make in essence, a training manual for young developers, young attorneys, and young debt and equity associates. That's a place for them to turn to really learn the development business in a very short kind of 120-page synopsis. I didn't want it to be a textbook that's 400 pages long and boring. And I wanted it something that they can walk through from, how do developers make money? Kind of a very fundamental question, which most lawyers don't know, all the way through, how do you finance a project? How do you work on a construction contract? What do you do when you have construction problems? How do you put your debt and equity together? And ultimately, how do you refinance or sell? And what is that in, what are the financial metrics for all that? What are the legal issues and all that?
You've mentioned that developers are fun people with a side of crazy, maybe a little bit ADD. Uh-huh. What makes a good developer? I've met a lot of developers in my time, not near as many as you've worked with probably, but I love the optimism that comes with that. But there's also some warning flags with that personality type. The best ones that you've worked with, what do they have in common? Well,
a couple of things. First of all, they're incredibly creative. They don't necessarily just go, okay, I want to build the next apartment box. The last developer I worked with, their goal was to always overbuild the market by about 30% in terms of their product type. They were always generating new thought processes about how to do crazy things like, where does the bathtub go in an apartment? How do the bathtub and the shower interrelate with each other? What do the apartment cabinets look like? How do we make them look more like a house and less like an apartment? How do we create all this social environment within the building so that the people want to be there and feel like this is more like a neighborhood, even though it may be a vertical neighborhood, than it is like just living in an apartment where people just come and go. They go to work and they come back and they're in their apartment and they go back to work the next day, creating more of a social network within the building, which I thought was really fascinating. I'd never really thought through those issues before. So their creativity, number one, their willingness to listen to the people around them, because I think some developers tend to be egomaniacs. They think that they know everything about everything. And the best ones will actually go, I want an architect that I spend a lot of time with that really understands my business, and I want to learn what they know. I want an attorney who's can be in my business. I really want them to guide me on how things should be set up. And I want to listen to their counsel. So it's not so much an autocratic system from top down, and it's more of a collaboration among peers. The last company I worked with, we had an architect on staff. We had a whole design group on staff where we got to design in all of our own projects, which was pretty cool to actually do that. It's very unusual in the development business to do that. We had our own construction company. The one thing we didn't do was management because we didn't want all those headaches. We had in-house legal counsel. We had in-house interior designers. And actually brought in-house doing all our own finance. So we had it all in one place where everyone was collaborative. We actually went to a design build model, which I thought was really cool, because what was happening over time is the cost of projects were getting out of hand and there were so many construction problems. And so we started even bringing in some of our major subcontractors to sit down with us at the very early levels of development to talk about how can we do this better? You tell us where you see the problems are and how can we save money and how we can actually build a better apartment complex without having the problems that we were having before. So those are the kind of things that make a great developer.
Did you see more developers come from the construction ranks or from the finance ranks?
Oh, much more from the finance ranks. I think most development companies are kind of built that way.
Yeah.
Construction guys are out in the field dealing with the nuts and bolts of building and all the subcontractor problems and all that stuff. They don't tend to really understand the finance stuff very well. And at the end of the day, if you can't finance something, it doesn't matter if you can build it. So most development companies are structured where they have kind of like a senior developer and then a junior developer and then an analyst. And over time, the analyst becomes a junior developer and then the junior developer becomes a senior developer. That seems to be kind of and then what happens is some of those people break off over time and form their own development companies. So that's kind of what happens.
Yeah, it's an incubator that ends up hatching best friends and or competitors.
Yeah, we say in Dallas that everybody in some way or another is related to Trammell Crow. It seems to be the way it's worked.
I'm waiting for the definitive history of that firm because there's so many offshoots that have come out of there.
Clearly.
What was it like building in Dallas? I mean, I was reading articles that you had written going back to 2012, 2011. So you were in Dallas for the last 10 years-ish. You saw a tremendous growth wave, maybe even longer than that.
Oh, yeah. I've been in Dallas since 1976. So
So you've seen that town. I mean, coming from Cowtown to one of the biggest cities in the country. Yeah. What was that like? Any interesting stories or anecdotes that you could share? I'm sure you've got a bushel of them.
Jeez, it'd be like where to start, really. There were so many waves. The 1990, early 90s kind of real estate crash, late 80s, early 90s real estate crash was to a large extent Texas driven. There was just an over exuberance in real estate and maybe a little too much creativity in finance during those years. Every syndication deal that you saw in the early to mid 80s, it's basically assumed that eventually the apartment complex, even if it was just a standard apartment, was going to be converted to condos and be worth 4 times what you built it for. So I think we learned a lot of lessons during that. And then again, I guess in the early 2000s, Dallas was kind of one of the hubs of the tech industry. And there was a big tech crash in Dallas. Now I think it's much more stabilized because I think that there's a lot more diversification. There's been a lot more, I guess, kind of rings put around finance that make it much more stable rather than it going crazy in one direction or another. I have seen multifamily be a huge part of the growth in Dallas and really in all of Texas. I think over 50% of the people in the state live in some form of rental product, which is kind of unusual, but it also has to do with the fact Texas has one of the youngest populations in the country. So it was really fun to watch. When I came out of law school in 1984, the hunt for young lawyers, real estate lawyers in particular, was just crazy. I mean, they couldn't bring enough people in to handle the volume of work that was going on. And the growth from really 84 to 2000 was just awesome to watch. He also just watched all these suburbs spring up like mad, it's like throwing fertilizer on the grass. And they just grew up like crazy in that era.
You mentioned over exuberance a couple of times in there. You've seen several shifts in the tide, as it were. The saying is history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yes.
What do you see today that rhymes with stuff you've seen in the past?
This is such an unusual time. The pandemic is not something that, we've seen in our lifetime. I guess maybe there are some people who are old enough to remember, some of the really bad disease pandemics that we had in the past. That created a real interesting set of problems, particularly for office and for central cities. I think we're having real trouble, from everything I'm hearing, getting people to come back to the center city and come back to the office. Young people in particular want flexibility in their work lifestyle, which, having worked like crazy for 40 plus years of my career, working Saturdays and nights and all that kind of stuff over the years, it's nice to see that people are at least thinking that way. I think it's tough for young people to be that because they have to ultimately get into their careers and advance in their careers. But I think it's going to be hard to bring people back to those office buildings. So I think we may see a big correction in office. I'm starting to hear that there's been overbuilding in warehouse space. I think Amazon's even saying that maybe they overbuilt warehouses. So I think that particular side of the industry is going to pull back, particularly if we go into some form of a recession. I don't think it's going to be major, but some form of a recession. I do think that multifamily is going to continue to be a rising star, in large part because as we just bought our house here in November, and if we had to buy our house again today based on today's interest rates versus what we paid in November, our mortgage payment would be 60% more. And being retired, that's something we could afford if we had to. It's nice that we locked in when we did. But if you're a young person right now trying to buy a house, that increase by 60% in your mortgage payment basically prices a lot of people out of the market, and it's going to push them back into multifamily. And multifamily is already strained because during the pandemic, a lot of the building that would have taken place kind of got shut down or slowed down. Plus lumber prices went crazy, as we all know, almost tripled. And that really caused a lot of projects to become unfeasible that people thought would be feasible. Although I think the drastic rise in rental rates has probably bailed out a lot of projects and managed to make them happen, even with high construction costs. So I think as lumber prices moderate, as labor prices for construction moderate because there's less construction going on, that you'll see a lot more multifamily being built. I don't know about the push to single family home rentals. That's one thing I don't really understand very well.
Yeah.
I think I kind of get it. It's a way to get people who want to live in houses quicker. I just worry that they've pushed that whole single family market to the brink, and we're going to see some pullback in single family home prices. So anyhow, that's kind of my macro view of the retail. Is a whole nother question we could get into, but with everything,
it feels like one of those things where you check your gut and you kind of go opposite your instinct.
I think so. Yes. Some retail out in the suburbs, because suburbs continue to boom and people don't want to move back into the inner city. I think I kind of understand, but it's real hard with the online push to see where that goes. So.
Yeah, the amount of vacant retail in some of those aging malls too.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how do you convert that? I know here in one of our main markets, Colorado Springs, there was a huge, I think it was a 500,000 square foot mall that they ended up demolishing the whole thing. Yeah. And 500 market rate apartments on it, because that was the best and highest use of the land. But there's, for every one of those that makes sense to demo and rebuild, there's probably 10 where the costs are just prohibitive. And it's just a looming specter on the town horizon.
Yeah, I think eventually they're all going to get, there's some very significant malls that will survive because they can, but I think a lot of them are going to end up having to go by the wayside, and they will become great mixed use redevelopment opportunities, but not for the faint of heart if you're a developer. That's all I can say. Yeah. Having worked on that big mixed use project out in LA, I see what happens if you don't time a market correctly on those big mixed use projects. You really have to have staying power to last through at least one cycle and maybe two to do those kinds of projects. They're super fun to work on, but you got to have a lot of capital behind you that's very patient to get through that.
Yeah. I think that's the key. We're getting into some development ourselves, and we just had a couple of projects hit our radar screen, and one in particular that was, huge. And ultimately we didn't have the experience and the wherewithal to stick it out. It's one of those that would probably be a 5-year effort, multiple thousand units and 500,000 of retail. It's like, this will be a phenomenal project for somebody, but we just don't have that level of patient capital. And I think that's really what development requires, right? Is knowing that there's going to be unknowns that pop up that derail your schedule by 6 months here and 3 months there and 10 weeks here. But if you're in a fundamentally strong market, like a DFW, like a Boise, you're going to end up reaping those rewards if you can forestall that.
Yes.
The downside.
Yeah, which kind of gets into the whole issue of pick your capital partners carefully. And if you think you need Mezz debt, you probably should think twice about doing your deal. That's one of the pieces of advice I gave to people. It's like, if you're thinking about going down that path, it's probably not a good path to go down.
And flesh that out for our audience. Maybe define what Mezz debt is. Maybe some folks aren't familiar with that term.
Sure.
But what risk does that bring in your eye to a development project?
You kind of have... has been relatively inexpensive for a long time, your basic construction debt and even permanent debt on apartments, which is, let's say that's 55 to 70% of your capital, of your entire project, your capital, we call the capital stack. Your typical thing to do is then you layer on top of that just kind of traditional equity, say 25, 30% of your construction costs is traditional equity. And part of that comes from the developer. Your debt at the bottom of the stack is kind of your least risky. And then at the top is your developer equity, which is most risky. And your institutional equity in the middle is kind of in the middle in terms of risk. What happens is sometimes construction costs go up. A lot of times construction costs go up.
Anymore, they always go up.
Yeah, exactly. Looks like you're going to blow your budget. Your debt won't go up because they're going, well, we're not sure you can get more rents to cover that. Your equity's like, well, we're kind of capped out. And so people go, well, maybe what we'll do instead, we'll put a little mezz debt between the developer and that traditional equity. And the problem is those guys are really like loan to own. They are kind of waiting for you to have a trip because they're going to take all that capital away that the developer puts in. They're going to take over your project and they're going to go restructure the entire deal and kind of beat up on everybody else underneath them. Those people are there are places where they make sense, but you better be very careful about how you do it because they really have a different mentality in how they look at a project. Your traditional equity partners, your institutions like Prudential Life Insurance or AEW or people like that, your big capital partners, they tend to say, we want to work with developers long-term who have a track record, and we're willing to be patient with them. And we like doing multiple deals with each developer. And they're really kind of become part of your team. Your mezz guys don't think about that at all. They're kind of warriors out there. And I just worry about what they're going to do to a project. So when I was the last couple places I was as a developer, I kept saying, if we had to do mezz debt, we better make sure the project's going to work because it's a lot of times that's just a way to lose your equity and lose all your developer fee. And it's just not a very fun place to be.
Working for free, especially in development where it's hard work, not a fun place.
No, not at all.
No, that's not why you do it. Could you share with us, we've talked a lot about some downside, the current climate, but I'd love to hear a story of one of your favorite projects that turned out well. Maybe some unique challenges that you overcame, a unique design, unique revitalization. Does something pop to mind?
Well, I'll talk about one in particular because I think it's one of the most fascinating deals that got done in Dallas in the last decade. Most apartments that are built in Dallas are your kind of typical, apartment that's, say your, 2-bedroom apartment's 900 feet and your 3-bedroom apartment's 1,100 feet. And they're typically built for young professionals, at least your higher end market rate deals. The company I work for, Streetlights Residential, they had a particular tract of land that they thought was intriguing because it's right over the Katy Trail, which is kind of our big pedestrian trail in Dallas, from Highland Park. And Highland Park's the wealthiest kind of suburb. It's kind of a suburb surrounded by the city of Dallas, but it's just north of downtown. Large homes, lots of people who are older in those neighborhoods who basically had no alternative once they decided to sell their homes of a place to go. And a lot of those people have second and third homes. They have a place in Aspen or Vail or in Montana or wherever.
This is old Dallas money.
Yeah, old Dallas money. Well, yeah, it's old Dallas money or kind of nouveau riche, I guess, that combination.
Yeah.
So what Streetlights said is, we've got this great tract of land that you can throw a stone over the Katy Trail to Highland Park. Why don't we look at building something totally different? So what they designed was this project called the McKinsey, which that's actually before I moved to Georgia, is where I lived, was in the 15th story of a high rise. I was the only Streetlights executive to actually live in one of their projects. But it's fascinating because the average unit size is 1,600 square feet.
Oh, wow.
Which is just massive. And they did this 5 years ago. Trying to get it financed was a real problem because no one believed that there was a market for that. And what it was, for lack of a better term, it's a condo building like you would see in Chicago or New York. It's that quality of finish. It's like high-end single-family home finish on the ground floor and in the common areas on the third floor. It has a covered dog park. It has a resident bar that's free to all the residents. It's just laid out. And then they pack that with a social program coordinator that would provide 3 or 4 times a month. You would have social programs among all the residents to try and create that, what we talked about before, that kind of sense of community. Yeah. Within the vertical living space. And what happened was this became kind of the place for empty nesters who no longer wanted to own a home, maintain a home. They want to be able to lock and leave and travel, but they don't want to get involved in a condo project because condos have all their own issues that you don't want to, like condo associations that you don't really want to deal with. What's great about it is you literally call up the desk downstairs and say, my light bulb's out. Can someone please change my light bulb? It was that easy in terms of a place to live. The finishes were extraordinary, and the rents they ended up getting were so far above pro forma. I think they pro forma'd it at like $275 a foot. And I think they're getting close to $4 a square foot now.
Oh my gosh. For that large of units.
Yes. The penthouse units, some of which are 300 square feet, they're getting $5.50 a square foot for. So you start thinking about what that does to your pro forma when you pro forma $2.75 a foot and you ending up at more like $3.50 a square foot. And you cap that into your cap rate with that increased rent, and the value of the project went through the roof.
Oh, yeah.
But it was an interesting project because no one thought that could be done in Dallas. It had never been done. And so it was fun to just go so out of the box and then to figure out how to get it financed. Fortunately, there was this group out of Canada that said, yeah, we're willing to finance it. They financed a couple of streetlights projects and then decided they wanted to get out of apartments altogether. And they really focused on single family rentals. But they ended up kind of bailing out early before the deal was fully occupied. And the streetlights had a co-general partner that was kind of their institutional equity founder of the company that stepped to the plate. It's a very wealthy family and bought out the institutional equity partner. It's a family office in Dallas that has buckets and buckets of money. And they bought out the equity, and that deal has been so incredibly profitable. It's probably the one legacy project that streetlights will never sell. You can't replace the site and you can't replace the project today. So
yeah,
it was a lot of fun to work on.
I appreciate you sharing. That's a really fascinating story. That goes to what you were saying earlier about the best developers are creative and they're not willing to accept the status quo. I would encourage our listeners, go to the MackenzieDallas.com. And you can see the pictures. I mean, the finishes are incredible. I'm browsing through the gallery now. Yeah, a testament to vision and execution.
It is, very much so. Yeah, you walk in and you're kind of just wowed and you walk in the lobby. Then you go see a unit and you're like, I had no idea this was a possibility. I convinced my wife, she says, oh, I won't live in an apartment. She saw that place. She's like, okay, I can do this. We sold a 5,500 square foot house to move into 1,800 square feet. And it was really fun.
That's incredible. Yeah, the views of downtown, spectacular. Well, Bob, I could keep you here all day, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this as well. But as we get ready to be respectful of your time and let you go, where can folks buy the book?
It's on Amazon, and you can buy it in Kindle form or paperback or hardback form. Is probably the easiest way to find it for most people. And like I said, I really wrote it for young people getting into the business who really want to know kind of development from A to Z without having to learn it through 5 years of hard knocks by working on projects. So hopefully it'll get a good reception and it's helpful to people. I'll probably never make any real money off of it. I don't really care. It was more just kind of a mind dump and kind of my giving back to the industry as I retired. So.
Well, I look forward to picking up a copy. Bob, really appreciate you joining the show. Wealth and knowledge, great stories. And thank you to our audience for joining us. It's been another episode of the Real Estate Syndication Show. I'm your host, Sam Rust, signing off.
Thank you for being a loyal listener of the show. Please subscribe and share it with your friends. We want to help you become the passive investor you've always wanted to become, but also the operator you've always wanted to become. We want to be the number one resource for your real estate investing journey. But go to lifebridgecapital.com where you can start investing in real estate today.